Okay, you can go ahead.
Everyone is different. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education believes that education is strongest when it embraces diversity. Learners should not have to adapt to the system. Instead, education systems should adapt to their needs. When students do not feel welcome in school, they are less likely to learn. This is everyone's loss. But rich and poor countries too often educate some children apart. Children who have a disability, have been displaced, speak a different language, or are poor and disadvantaged. School design may favor some students over others, as do many laws and policies. Teachers are often ill-equipped to cater for students' diverse needs. Children may not recognize the way they are portrayed in textbooks. Some may not see themselves there at all. They receive the message that they do not belong. Testing sometimes follows a narrow vision of education, and consequently, some students leave education earlier than they should. These are complex problems to solve, but a belief in the right to education is a belief in inclusion. Children have different learning speeds and needs. They need curricula that are flexible, creative, and relevant. How we prepare teachers matters. They must be given the tools and training to achieve our vision for reform. The resources we know can help the marginalized, educators, support staff, and equipment should be shared so that everyone can benefit. Better data on those left behind will help us reach them. Disadvantages often accumulate. We can't address inclusion one group at a time. Redressing these disadvantages requires funds. These must be equitable and target individual-specific needs. We must work together on these tasks across government ministries, from central to local authorities, with civil society supporting governments, and schools opening doors to the community. Inclusion in education requires a change in mindset in society, so that education for all means education for everyone, without exception. Achieving this is everybody's business, including yours.
Welcome, everyone. We're so delighted that you could join us today for this side event during the 2022 Global Disability Summit, co-hosted by Save the Children Norway, UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, the Global Campaign for Education, Light for the World, and the Cambridge Network for Disability and Education Research. My name is Jennifer Rigg, and I serve as the Executive Director at GCE US, where we co-host the Inclusive Education and Early Childhood Community of Practice. We want to hear from all of you. Please introduce yourselves in the chat box. I am now going to briefly explain some of the features of today's event. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed. There is international sign interpretation, language interpretation in French, Spanish, and English, and closed captioning in English. Please select the globe icon or language interpretation within Zoom to choose the language that you would like to hear. Should you have questions, kindly leave them in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box and will try to respond to questions during the event where possible. We would like to have as much interaction with participants as possible throughout the event and invite you to pose questions in the Zoom Q&A or question and answer function or in the chat box. We will look to answer some of these in our discussion, so please keep them coming. Today's event will examine lessons learned from the Global Education Monitoring or GEM report and the COVID-19 pandemic, and promising practices and solutions to address barriers to inclusive education for learners with disabilities, sharing a global call to action to prioritize disability inclusive education. We are delighted to discuss these important topics today with leaders including young persons with disabilities, experts, academics, and representatives from civil society, government, and the World Bank. Looking into the future, the 2023 GEM report will focus on technology. Today, we will also touch upon opportunities that technologies can bring to students with disabilities and in the context of the pandemic. We came together just a few short weeks ago at the Global Disability Summit Inclusive Education Thematic Workshop to issue a call to action. These recommendations are based on the menu of commitments developed by the Global Disability Summit organizers. They point to responsibilities and actions that are needed to implement the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 4 on education, realizing the right to inclusive education for all. We are hoping that this call to action will urge governments and all stakeholders to make bold commitments investing in disability inclusive education right from the start, now and in the years to come. If you are able, please use the social media toolkit that is being shared in the chat box to help spread the word. We are delighted to collaborate with all of you joining us today. We request all speakers to kindly keep to times and to ensure that they speak slowly enough for the interpreters to follow. I would like to ask all speakers to briefly describe themselves. Please, to everyone, help amplify the conversation and share key points on social media with the hashtags GDS 2022, GDSIE for inclusive education, and all means all. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ana Cristina Diadio, Senior Policy Analyst and Thematic Lead with the Global Education Monitoring Report, who will present key lessons from the 2020 GEM report on inclusion and education and highlight opportunities for students with disabilities and adaptive technology through the next GEM report. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jennifer, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this side event. It is a pleasure for me to be here today to present some of the lessons learned from the 2020 GEM report on inclusion in education, and also about the COVID-19 pandemic, and to discuss how technology can improve access to education for children and learners with disability. In this respect, as Jennifer briefly touched upon, I would like to highlight that technology and education will be the theme of the 2023 Global Education Monitoring Report, which will explore how technology affects education, looking at two main questions: what education problems technology can address? This is the first one. And then the second one, which conditions need to be met for this to become a reality? And in this respect, the 2023 Global Education Monitoring Report will examine, for instance, issues of access, equity, and inclusion in education, looking at ways through which technology can help to reach disadvantaged learners, such as learners with disabilities, but also ensure more knowledge reaches more people and more learners in engaging with a cheaper formats. But its content, as you will see in 2023, will extend to other issues. And please, if you have not yet done so, take a look at the concept note and take part in the consultation that is still open. But let me now go back to the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on inclusion in education that was launched during the outbreak of the corona pandemic in June 2020. The report warned at that time that education opportunities continues to be unequally distributed and that barriers to quality education are still too high for too many learners. 1 in 5 children, adolescents, and youth are entirely excluded from education, and children with disabilities are more likely to be out of school than their peers, suggesting that they are amongst the hardest to be reached. In addition, stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination mean millions more are further alienated and segregated inside classroom. The COVID-19 pandemic has posed unprecedented challenges to inclusion, exposing the digital divide, stretching teacher capacity, and setting inclusivity backwards for learners who lack connectivity. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report define inclusion education first and foremost as a process that contributes to the overall goal of social inclusion. It consists of actions that embrace diversity and build a sense of belonging. And these actions should all be rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential. Every person should be respected and valued regardless of their background, ability, or identity, as each and every one of us come with our differences. Inclusion in education, as a result, should start with education for all. And in order to strengthen education systems so that they do not leave anyone behind, we need to enhance the collection and publication of disaggregated data. And we know very well all here that until very recently, there was no consensus on defining and measuring disability, and its links to school attendance and learning achievement were obscure. The Washington Group short set of questions on disability has been gaining momentum. Although we know that even with the United Nations Disability Statistic Database, few results contained these questions. And they were adopted in the 6th round of the UNICEF Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey and other survey that collect a combination of information on disability, school attendance, and foundational proficiency skills in reading and mathematics. However, despite progress, we know very well that still a lot of challenges remain in the collection and use of this data. Some are very technical, and other really concern the fact that the collection of this data is still very scarce. For students with disability, beyond the data, inclusion means more than placement or sitting in the same classroom with peers. The CRPD in this respect marked a break not just in the historical tendency to exclude children with disability from education or to segregate them in special schools, but also with the practice of putting them in separate classes for much or most of the time. Inclusion, however, is much more than that, is much more than placement, and involves many changes in schools and in learning, and also not only in learning and teaching, but also in ethos. And we know that while the CRPD did not explicitly prohibit special schools or separate teaching, the Article 24 gave same important direction in defining inclusive education. And recent reports by the Committee on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities increasingly point towards the ambition of full inclusion. If it is necessary to expose exclusionary practices by many governments that contravene the commitments adopted with the CRPD, the limits to how flexible mainstream schools and education systems can be should also be acknowledged. It is not only critical to ensure mainstream education is desired for all, it is necessary to develop targeted support to address the specific needs of children with disabilities. Once a system is structured and designed to respond to the need of all, there will be less need for targeted support. However, as the JAMA report highlights, we are very far from this ideal in many countries, be they low or high-income countries. And these concerns very often children with disabilities, but also children and learners that have present other factors that put them at risk of exclusion. But the answer for children with disability cannot be to use specialist resources to build separate tracks. It means instead using those specialistic resources to enhance the capacity of the systems to respond to the needs of all learners and find ways to share knowledge and expertise. And this cannot be done overnight. It requires commitment by every one of us that have an interest in building better education system and ultimately a better world. The SDG 4 agenda calls on countries to prioritize policies that reach the most marginalized and leave no one behind. And this requires new policies to address these imbalances and make sure that the progress by 2030 is equitable reachable and no one is left behind. We know that we will not make progress towards the global education goals by working in silos. And as the 2020 GEM report underlines, we must engage in stronger partnerships with other sectors that extend beyond the mere planning and even involve implementation to achieve SDG 4. Everyone here today, including representatives from national governments, civil society actors, and members of the donor community, has a shared responsibility to help achieve inclusive and quality education for all by 2030. And the report's 10 messages are precisely this call to action we should heed as we seek to pave the way for a more resilient and equal society, as the world enters the final decade of action to achieve SDG 4 and fulfill its commitment to inclusive education. And one of the core objectives of the 2022 Global Disability Summit is to showcase best practices and evidence from across the world on disability inclusion, development, and mobilize targeted and concrete commitments on inclusive education. The call to action that Jennifer presented demonstrates the importance of calling on stakeholders to make commitments to realize the right to education for all. And I join my voice to the voice of colleagues present at this side event to urge governments and other stakeholders to implement Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities and to make bold commitments toward investing in inclusive education and lifelong learnings for learners with disability now and in the years to come. And more of this will also be found in the next 2023 report, GEM report on technology in education that will, as I said, look at how technology can access, can enhance access to education for disadvantaged learners, including learners with disability, but also the barriers and challenges that this process present and that these students confront. And so this is also we saw during the pandemic. And I think it's really important that every one of us commit to foster and disseminate the message that really all means all, because if we believe that education should be really built for all and not just a few. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Anna. We are looking forward to the 2023 GEM report on technology and education, and I encourage everyone to join that online consultation. We also invite everyone to share questions for speakers in the Zoom Q&A function. Please specify if your question is for a specific speaker or for multiple people. I would now like to welcome our wonderful panelists to join the discussion. In order to increase accessibility during the event, please briefly describe yourselves. And first, I'm honored to introduce Nidhi Singhal, Professor of Disability and Inclusive Education at the University of Cambridge. Nidhi, given your work with parents and teachers during the COVID-19 pandemic, please reflect on the key findings and the impact of these on inclusive education.
Many thanks for your question, Jennifer. Hello, everybody. My name is Nidhi, and I convene the Cambridge Network for Disability and Education Research. A very brief visual description. I'm a middle-aged brown woman with long black hair and black eyes, and I'm wearing a red top. So now in response to Jennifer's question, in October 2020, during extended school closures across many countries, we conducted telephone interviews with over 600 carers and teachers across Nepal, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Qatar to really understand the learning lives of children with disabilities who had been attending school prior to the closures during COVID-19. Unsurprisingly, the narratives we gathered were rich and emotional. And I'm going to reflect briefly on three key points here. Yes, the pandemic has affected all children, but the impact on those with disabilities has been particularly severe, more so given the significant lack of responsiveness to their needs in many contexts. And Anna pointed out that in her presentation too. In our research, both carers and teachers expressed significant concerns around loss of learning opportunities and the impact that it would likely to have on children's prospects. In many cases, parents noted the absence of any accessible learning resources at home to help support their child's learning. And also they talked about how they were unable to provide any support because of the lack of experience or even simple things, lack of understanding of sign language. Even more profound were the discussions that we had with carers around how school closures had resulted in loss of structure and social emotional support for their child. Majority of the carers noted that the child with disabilities seemed sadder, lonelier, and more anxious than normal. Thus, one of the significant implications from these insights is a reiteration that schools matter, and inclusive schools matter even more. We need schools to nurture inclusive learning and also inclusive learning outcomes. The second key point that I'd like to make is the impact of the pandemic on teachers with disabilities, a workforce we don't seem to mention much in debates around inclusive education. In a different report, in a different research we conducted with teachers with disabilities across Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nepal, and India, here teachers noted the challenges at workplace had been amplified during the pandemic. They talked about increased barriers in getting to school. They talked about increased workloads due to shift systems being put in place and increased fears about their own health and well-being with little or no support being offered. The key takeaway here thus being to make inclusion a reality, we need to nurture and invest in an inclusive teaching workforce, including teachers with disabilities, as they are not only important just role models, but also play an important role in nurturing an inclusive school culture, and they embody inclusive pedagogy. My final point is I would like to underscore the importance of inclusive evidence generation. There are innumerable examples of large-scale studies in education which were undertaken during COVID-19, which really failed to gather meaningful disaggregated data on children with disabilities. This is a real oversight. As we move forward, we really need to acknowledge that any efforts to build back better, as seems to be the current discourse, need to be underpinned by robust evidence, both quantitative and qualitative. And this evidence must be generated in partnership with those who are the real experts, that is, persons with disabilities. And I'll end my remarks here, Jennifer.
Thank you so very much. Our next speaker is Seme Lado Michael, Disability Inclusion Facilitator with Light for the World in South Sudan and founder of the South Sudan Union of Persons with Disabilities, who will talk about the role of organizations of persons with disabilities in creating an inclusive movement and the situation of learners with disabilities in South Sudan. In the past 3 years, South Sudan has made great strides in disability inclusive education. Seme, what are the key initiatives that have led to traction and progress?
You can hear me well.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank for the organizers that invited me to this program. Also put it me as one of the panelists. The policy, yes, the policy was adopted, inclusive education policy in South Sudan, adopted in 2021. After this inclusive education launch, one of the great achievements that there has been greater investment in ensuring girls' education programs are disability inclusive. As a Light for the World, also using an innovative model of training up to 24 disability inclusion facilitators. And it may be question will ask itself that why did we recruited 34 disability inclusion facilitators? The reason why, because inclusive education in South Sudan, especially for a person with disability, our community has to has to be aware, okay, and who will do that one, which means that person with disability with themselves has to create more awareness so that community will understand that learners with disability have right to education. And among these 34 young facilitators, we have 2 professional teachers with visual impaired. And the reason why we created that to support education program, okay, in education emergency and in schools to implement inclusive education, because we have that program of inclusive education in emergency in the IDP camps. We call them Mangaten 1 and 2, and then we have Mahat. Also, the same group, the 32 facilitators, also supporting inclusive sport, and also we know that inclusive sport also playing a role in education. Also, we have humanitarian action and economic empowerment. The key things that we have, the key success: 1, building an inclusive movement that include NGOs, UN agencies, OPDs, and champion within the Ministry of Education, and recruiting other human rights activists to lobby and advocates. And the reason why this one, it came after 2000, after the launching of the South Sudan Union of Persons with Disabilities in 2020. And also we have trained, as I mentioned earlier, that we have trained some of activists, like we have one of the strong organizations for activists. It's called SEPO, and he's advocating much, okay, to make sure that inclusion education is practicing in the country. The 2 success thing is that awareness raising at all levels, beside road shows to various regional education barriers. This, for example, to make it good, this week, the inclusive education policy presented in the parliament with the aim getting better investment for for implementations. Okay, and for example, since last year until now, we are carrying activity of disseminating this policy to other states. Also, the other thing, which is the final thing, writing disability inclusion in all education program is critical. For example, Save the Children and other mainstreaming organization education actors are more serious about disability inclusion, and this must continue. So these are the things that few things that I want to share with you in case of any question because of the time. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's the perfect segue. We're so grateful to you for your work. And you just mentioned Save the Children. Next, we're honored to hear from Berget Langa, CEO of Save the Children Norway. How does Save the Children work with organizations of persons with disabilities on inclusive education? And how will you accelerate the work on disability inclusion? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, and hello, everybody. My name is Birgitte, and I am the CEO of Save the Children Norway. I'm delighted to be here. I am 55 years old. I wear glasses. I have brown, blonde hair and a blue jacket and a white shirt. Save the Children has over the past 3 years been part of the consortium Together for Inclusion. And this consortium consists of 15 Norwegian civil society organizations. Half of them are organizations of persons with disabilities, and it's led by the Atlas Alliance, the umbrella organization of organizations of persons with disabilities here in Norway. Through the Together for Inclusion consortium, we have, in cooperation, developed a unique and comprehensive program that puts organizations of persons with disabilities in the driving seat. They have become an important guide and partner for us, both by giving advice on inclusive education programming and together influence national and local decision-making processes. We believe that we will only achieve sustainable and high-quality programs that respond to children's needs if we include persons with disabilities in the advocacy we do towards local and national government structures. A small but very specific example of how engaging persons with disabilities and the representative organization have influenced our work to be better is that of letting sports trainers with disabilities, that they train sport trainers without disabilities in regular community schools. They are trained in how to carry out sports and games that are inclusive to all children, including children with various forms of impairments. Not only do these inclusive sports and games allow everyone to participate, but it also serves as a very powerful advocacy and awareness tool in the local communities that often leads to attitudinal change in people. At a global level, Save the Children has raised the focus on children with disabilities in our new strategy for the period to the next 3 years, 2022 to 2024. We are saying that we will protect the rights of children most impacted by inequality and discrimination now and for the future. And at the end of last year, we launched our first disability inclusion policy, where we, together with others and amongst others, make a specific commitment to partnering with the representative organizations of persons with disabilities at different levels. And moving forward, we want to deliver on our ambition in our global strategy. At the Global Disability Summit, we have presented 12 commitments on how to go forward and how to accelerate our work on disability inclusion. Amongst the 12 commitments, there are clear commitments on how to increase our collaborations with organizations of persons with disability and on building capacity in inclusive education. A concrete and specific action is making sure our implementation is guided by evidence-based resources and tools. And Save the Children has recently launched the Inclusive Education Resources and Toolkit. And on 1st of March, we will host a global event, and you are all invited to participate in that launch. The Inclusive Education Resources Toolkit is a resource and reference for all staff working in education programming. It provides recommendations and resources to strengthen inclusive education programming to enable us to provide more inclusive and high quality early childhood care and development and basic education programs. The resource can be used both in humanitarian and development contexts and include many resources relevant for programming and for learners with disabilities. I don't think that Save the Children would have been as committed to lift barriers without strong contributions by OPDs. We learn every day, especially from working with children with disabilities. This helps us to eliminate as many barriers as possible, and in addition to make sure that their voices are being heard. Too often adults make policies and decisions on behalf of children with disabilities, while the children themselves are not asked or listened to. Only if we listen to children and work on their demands and their requests will we have a learning environment inclusive for all children to learn and thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your leadership. Next, we're delighted to introduce Josh Josa, Disability Inclusive Education Specialist with USAID. Josh, how can donors and the international community increase disability inclusive education funding and ensure that learners with disabilities are not left further behind? What challenges has the pandemic posed?
Excellent. Thank you so much for the question and also having me here today. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Josa. My pronouns are he and him. I am a white male with dark brown eyes and hair. I am deaf, so the voice that you're hearing currently is my wonderful ASL interpreter. I'm from USAID Center for Education. I am a disability inclusive education specialist. To answer your question, prior to the big shift caused by COVID-19 to the education system, we were already focused on making sure students with disabilities were not left behind. And still today, we're making progress towards achieving that goal. But now we have an extra layer of COVID-19. Seeing students with disabilities disproportionately impacted, and some of them even not being able to attend school without equitable access to platforms and content. And also, what's even worse is more social isolation. What can we do together? I think that we have an opportunity to build back better by doing two things: integrating principles of universal design for learning in all of our programming throughout the education continuum, and leveraging and galvanizing investments related to universal design for learning. If we all work to make sure that all new education programming integrates UDL principles, we are building a minimum standard for how we can recruit student interest, providing multiple means of students understanding and information, as well as showing their understanding of the information. If we think that that's it, there's so much more work that needs to be done. But setting that minimum standard of UDL is just half the work, and setting a safety net for, if not for most, if not all students. Secondly, we want to catalyze financing. There are so many critical opportunities for co-investment, co-financing, education activities, including working with non-state schools, as well as trying new avenues for delivering education in various innovative ways, whether that be remotely, in person, or in combination with many things. I'm proud to say that USAID has already made commitments to both of these areas. And we have programming that's already in progress and happening, helping us learn more quickly. So I look forward to sharing that information with you all. I'd love to get more in depth, but we don't have a lot of time to talk about this in detail. So instead of sharing the details, I invite all of you to please continue these conversations with us and all together. Come and join our Lead Through Learning global platform, Learning Network. And we have it on USAID's website, education website on EduLinks. And I'll add that to the chat also. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Josh. And thanks for sharing those resources. We know the 23 US government commitments at the Global Disability Summit were just made earlier today. If and when that information is available, especially those on inclusive education and early childhood topics, the things impacting children and youth across sectors, I know this group would really love to help amplify and share that. So next, please welcome Hannah Olafsutari, who is the Global Thematic Lead for Inclusive Education at the World Bank. The World Bank has been investing in technical experience and resources to support countries in making education fully inclusive for children and youth with disabilities. Hannah, how does the COVID-19 pandemic provide an opportunity for rethinking education with a more inclusive lens? And what is the World Bank planning to do next to accelerate progress on disability inclusive education?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm very happy to be here. Delighted to have heard also the other panelists who've spoken before me. So I think one of the positive impacts of this horrific past 2 years has really been that the value of education and educators have been acknowledged, and more, almost all learners benefit of inclusive education approaches when being homeschooled, learning virtually at home, and also when returning to school. So equity and inclusion are really considered more. I think it's been very much acknowledged that there is more mentioning about that, and really thinking that how can we support the learners who have gone through such 2 years that have not been easy for most of the students. We do have also some experiences of students who have actually benefited of being, either in a smaller group or at home, and actually also achieving more from that way. I think at the same time, we need to now also make sure that when parents have been at home and also needing to take the role of educator, sometimes supporting their children, they understand that what kind of profession, teacher's profession really is, that then the support that teachers now need is also going to be there. So at the same time, when the attention is now more on how can we actually support all learners for quality education system development, the avenues for understanding that inclusive education is actually something that can benefit all students is there. But then at the same time, it is important to understand that what kind of situations have there been for learners with disabilities. It's been, again, the group that has been very much marginalized, forgotten, and not really considering in the beginning for responding for the shock of COVID. But I think what is important now is really to make sure that further planning and next steps are considering this. And I understand, Jennifer, you're going to let me know when about I need to stop so that I don't go over time. I want to briefly mention that in the World Bank, we have really taken seriously the commitment that was made in the Global Disability Summit 2018. We promised that all education projects will be disability inclusive. And we've carried out a portfolio review on those projects that are going to be active 2025 and beyond, and are really following closely that the 4 criteria that we have in our guidance for all education teams working with investment project financing, lending projects, that they really are going to be going through the stakeholder engagement, ensuring that persons with disabilities are represented, the organizations of persons with disabilities or otherwise. Also, there is a criteria related to analysis, thinking that disability disaggregated data is utilized. If it's not there, there are ways to collect it and make sure inclusive design of projects is there. We have acknowledged for twin track approach, and the teams can choose either general education approach or specific one. But this is also important to be monitored. So looking at accelerating, accelerating progress on disability inclusion, I think it's just important that it's part of everything that we do related to educational planning. But I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you for all your work, Hannah. Now we're delighted to hear from Nafisa Babu, Director on Inclusive Education at Light for the World and Global Campaign for Education Board member. Nafisa is also on the GEM Report Advisory Board. Nafisa, please share your perspective on what's next in inclusive education. How do we use the learning from the GEM Report and COVID-19, plus the Global Disability Summit commitments happening today and tomorrow to accelerate progress?
Thank you, Jennifer. Before I answer the question, a really great question, let me describe myself. So I am brown skinned, I have short hair, and I'm visually impaired and middle-aged. And I'm really happy to be here, and I have a big smile on my face. So I really see that there's a lot of opportunity here moving forward. And the 3 areas that I think the opportunities that I see that we can focus on in the next few 2 years are really sharing best practices and evidence. And the second area I thought is really educating ourselves about education finance. And thirdly is being strategic around our advocacy efforts moving forward. So, we now see there's really great potential around using technology in education. And this is fantastic. And we need to share more widely these best practices and examples of evidence on not just how technology provides access to education, but also how it improves learning outcomes. So today, the technology that was first designed for people with visual impairment, moving text into speech or video messaging, that now assists sign language users, are now being normalized in society. And technology in education, I feel, will soon be normalized in education. So we really, really must make an effort to hardwire disability inclusion in all EdTech projects moving forward. So we also need to make sure, like I said, that our activists are educated. So around issues around education, financing, and budgeting. ActionAid, the Global Campaign for Education, and Light for the World are developing a gender responsive and disability inclusive budgeting toolkit on education. And our aim is really not just to empower activists in the education sector, but also in the disability sectors, ministers of education and financing, on how to really do better budgeting around inclusive education and also gender issues. And this will also help us to hold governments accountable as well. So we also need to be really strategic, right, about our advocacy efforts. The truth is there's so many issues to tackle, and I think there's a tendency to want to solve all the problems at once. But let's use this upcoming Global Education Monitoring Report that focuses on technology to really boost our joint advocacy efforts to make sure that all initiatives focusing on education technology hardwire disability inclusion. And I think it's incredibly important now, especially since governments are putting in place austerity measures. So great initiatives that hold promise, such as the AT scale that focus on widespread dissemination of technology, are at risk. So really, we really now have to make sure that donors and governments hardwire accessible technologies and make in education programming and make sufficient budgets available for not just providing those technologies, but also the training that is required to make use of those technologies most effectively. And that's often forgotten. So I think the real key message I want to say moving forward is that we need to move to work together, the education and disability sectors, so that we leave no one behind. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Nafisa. Really impactful. And we're delighted to all of you for sharing your ideas, your resources. We invite everyone to share questions for the speakers in the Zoom Q&A function if you haven't already had a chance to do so. And please specify if your question is for a specific speaker. We're going to open up the conversation specifically. We have one question that has come in asking, are there guidelines and/or tools that help to improve utilization of disability disaggregated data to inform program project design, planning, and budgetary decisions in our effort to make education programs effectively inclusive of children with disabilities? So I'll ask if any of the panelists would like to come in on that. And then at the same time, because we have just a few brief moments, we're broadly asking panelists to respond to how can new commitments and action ensure ambitious and widespread progress to push the disability inclusive agenda forward. We don't want to wait until the next Global Disability Summit. We absolutely want to be accelerating progress on behalf of children and youth with disabilities all over the world. So grateful to see that people are connecting in the chat box as well, and we invite everybody to join the Inclusive Education and Early Childhood Community of Practice. Nidhi, would you like to come in briefly with any response on resources and acceleration?
Thanks, Jennifer. I was busy engaging with the chat responses, so I think I got the tail end of your question, which is very much around disaggregated data and what kind of toolkits, etc., are available. If I'm not mistaken, Jennifer, I do apologize. I was totally distracted in responding to the chat questions. But just
no, my apologies. Yeah, thank you. And we'll put the question in the chat for everybody to see it exactly. And people are all invited to share guidelines or tools is the question that would help in terms of disability disaggregated data, specifically with education programs. Thank you.
Absolutely, Jennifer. The ones which we have used quite substantially as the Washington group questions, especially the short set and the long set. And we found them really powerful, especially in looking at issues around learning outcomes and how children with disabilities get disadvantaged in classrooms in relation to the quality of teaching that they experience, and hence the impact it has on their learning outcomes. So putting together disaggregated disability data in relation to the UNICEF and Washington group short sets of questions. So I'm going to stop there. That's the one which we use very often.
If I can add something, I think the Global Education Monitoring Report has a chapter on data, and with some useful resources that can also guide or suggest other websites where to look at this information. And moreover, as I have not had the time to say that, but we have developed country profiles of inclusive education, and there is a part also on monitoring and reporting, listing where there are resources linked in each countries of statistics and data with inclusive education and people, learners with disabilities.
Thank you so much. And absolutely, we'll share with everybody who has registered the resources that are shared here afterwards. As a person with a visual disability, I often find that that some of these materials are harder to make and to enlarge and make visible as well. So we will make sure to share it in full format. And next we'll go to Josh Josa. Thank you, Josh, for sharing specifically USAID's resources on disability data disaggregation, and anything else that you'd like to briefly share.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for allowing me the space to share. I've already added to the chat. USAID does have great resources related to education, as well as disaggregation of disability data in education, with the understanding that it's just a starting point. We recognize that there's still so much work to be done, and we are in the process of piloting new ways of finding disability data within the classroom, working with the Washington group as well as UNICEF. So look forward to that information, but we do have some resources. I also mentioned that disability data is important. However, at the same time, I'm pleading for you all not to allow data to be the reason you don't do work, because we know that we have children with disabilities out there and they need education and they need to be included. So data is important, but don't let that stop the work and the education to be provided. Thank you.
So important. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's sharing resources in the chat box. Hannah, is there anything that you'd like to come in with in terms of the discussion and resources requested?
Sure, thank you, Jennifer. So I also just put, I think the guidance note for disability inclusion in education, just as an example, also for those colleagues who are in this event and might be collaborating with the World Bank staff in different country offices, it's maybe helpful also just to know what kind of guidance different organizations are using. And I think it's the alignment and really networking that we can do in different levels, in global level, regional level, and country level, to understand, those ways, the frameworks that people work with, and really also then help to come in to create something that the program, the countries are already involved in. I think the way World Bank projects are often planned be also extended. So it's a certain period of time. And of course, the country dialogue with the government happens. And I think that's important, that every stakeholder, when coming into a country, understands that what's been going on and how that intervention that they work will really support the whole. I think we've gone beyond the times when it was just only silos of different actors working by themselves, giving hard time sometimes for the Ministry of Education or others, other line ministries working related to inclusive education system development. So I think that's just important that we are aware of those resources. We are also able to really get back to the networks and to people in order to find the best way to support the specific countries. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of your work. And we're just so grateful to all of the speakers, panelists, participants today. To close this impactful session, we're pleased to welcome Rafat Sabah, President of the Global Campaign for Education. And we want to thank all of you and all of the organizations that made this possible. Over to you, Rafat.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks for all the speakers. It's really show the importance of this issue, especially after this pandemic. All of us know that in this pandemic, the COVID has shed light on systems, failures to pursue the ideals of the solidarity and diversity and pluralism and the growing inequality within education system for the most marginalized groups, which has been really highlighted more than ever before. Around the world, the teachers have also been directly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The school as well. The school closure found many teachers unprepared for the move to remote learning, uncertain about their role and unfamiliar with the technology. The pandemic has also posed unprecedented challenges to children with disability and accessing technology. School reopening found teachers without a clear support in making up for loss of infrastructure time, protecting their own health and taking measures to protect the student health, and therefore less time to focus on children with disability. Internet access at home remains out of reach for most in at least developed countries, but some countries are making efforts to increase access in schools. The issue of people with disability, it's very important. The inclusive issue is very important in education, not just at the national level, it's worldwide. And for GCE, this is very important issue. GCE has equality and non-discrimination embedded as one of the key strategic area within its current strategic plan. This includes inclusive education and ensuring that children with disability have access to education and accessible facilities. There are more than 240 million children living with disability in the world, and half of them are out of the school. Many are invisible, hidden by their families and abandoned by their governments. GCE believes that regardless of the ability, all children have the human rights to quality and equal education. Yet, children and youth with disabilities are often overlooked in policy making, restricting their access to education and their ability to participate in social, economic, and political life. Worldwide, they face persistent barriers to education stemming from discrimination, stigma, and the routine failure of decisions makers to incorporate disability in school services. A recent report published by UNESCO estimates that 186 million children living with disabilities worldwide have not completed primary school. In context of emergency, including conflict, displacement, disasters, education is frequently interrupted or denied, and the international community has often failed to ensure the human rights to education for those living in emergency situations. Children and youth are usually the most affected through emergency situations, especially people displaced or in situation of conflict and crisis. also affect teachers and adult learners. Among them, children with disabilities are routinely denied their right to education, so they miss out on these critical and often life-saving interventions. Some studies recently also show that in refugee camps, for instance, girls with disabilities are less likely to attend the school than boys with disabilities. Children, adults, and youth with disabilities are often excluded from education and society due to the physical, ideological, systematic, or communication barriers, but they also faced with stigma and prejudice. The need for more inclusive society requires considerable financial investment and social policies, which transform often negative system beliefs. We learn from the GEM report about the inclusive education, as Anna explained. In most countries, education for children with disabilities was historically provided by non-state charitable actors. Over time, governments have adopted legislation on inclusive education that expects all children to attend local mainstream schools. But when their transition is not well prepared, these students may suffer from prejudice and stigmatizations. Parents who feel public schools are not certainly for the needs for their children may place them back to non-state special schools. Non-state schools reacting to pressure to compete may exclude some students, including children with disability, violating core principle of equity and non-discrimination in education.
Thank you.
Inclusion, in order to address the challenges that children with disability face to achieve education, GCE aim to ensure that the advocacy capabilities of GCE National Coalition on Disability Inclusive Education is strengthened. GCE is committed to working for the human rights of girls and women, people with disabilities, youth, ethnic minorities, migrants, internally displaced and refugees, indigenous people, LGBTI communities, and those who have been denied and the human rights to education. We think that diversity of voices strengthens our movement, and by amplifying them, we create the necessary condition to build fairer society.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rafat, for those powerful closing remarks. Thank you to all of you for being with us today. And please continue this discussion on social media using the hashtags GDS2022, GDSIE, and all means all. All of you are invited to join the community of practice as shared in the chat and at bit.ly/join-IECOP. Please join me in thanking everyone who made today's event possible, including the co-hosts, Save the Children Norway, the GEM Report team, Light for the World, GCE, and the Cambridge Network for Disability and Education Research. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to connecting with you again extremely soon. Thank you for your work on behalf of children and youth with disabilities around the world.